Hello and welcome to the Power of Passive Investing webinar series. We have an incredible guest today, Rae Nomura. Not only that she's CCIM and MAI, but she's also a broker with SVN, serving all the commercial investors. And yes, that includes the multifamily folks, for those that are wondering. But she has an incredible background, and we're going to talk about her background in a little while. But before we get to that, I want to give Rae the floor and have her share a little bit about her background and expertise. Welcome, Rae.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Rae Nomura, I am currently a broker at SVN, specializing in investment sales, particularly in retail, multifamily mixed use. But I started my journey in commercial real estate as an appraiser, worked on primarily retail for a while, and then as the market switched, did a lot of apartments, multifamily, mixed use throughout the state of Oregon and the state of Washington. Got my MAI and worked in the appraisal realm for about 9 years. Got burnout, really enjoy people and enjoy working and talking to people and underwriting, and decided to take the leap and become a broker a little over 2 years ago. So I am licensed in Oregon and Washington, and now operating as a broker with Sperry Van Ness, a local franchise of Ryan Embry, so SVN Embry. It's a great organization to be a part of as well. So,
Rae, just for those of our listeners that are not familiar with MAI certification, I'm assuming it's a certification for appraisers, but feel free to chime in.
yes, MAI is, I call it like the doctorate, or the kind of the big deal to become an appraiser. It's similar to a CCIM, which I now have my CCIM as well on the brokerage side, but it's a designation. You belong to the Appraisal Institute, and really just means that you have gone through the process, the education, and proven your skills to really be able to underwrite and understand valuation of commercial real estate properties. On the appraisal front, it's certified general, which means you could do residential. Most anybody that's certified general doesn't, though. That means that you've also done the capabilities to work on all commercial assets. I am, full disclosure, mine is on hold now, so I'm still technically an MAI, but I do not operate as a appraiser currently.
Does that require you to complete certain hours in the field? Is that what they're
It's just to sort of alleviate the liability that I am not acting as an appraiser. I'm currently acting as a broker. We can muddy the waters pretty quickly when that starts to go down a path. So I've just removed myself from operating currently as an appraiser, but I still hold my license and I still hold my MAI. It's just on a hold status.
Yeah, you still basically you put a lot of efforts to obtain that certification, and you practice it for a while, much longer than you practice in the brokerage. So yeah.
Yeah, and I still have to keep up with my continuing ed. Actually, I just finished my 30 hours a couple months ago to continue to know exactly what's going on in the appraisal world.
Congratulations. Yeah, so let's talk about that expertise. Tell our audience a little bit, how do you tap into your appraising expertise and track record and translate it when you bring in commercial real estate deals to your clients these days?
Sure. Yeah, so that's my favorite part about being a broker and getting to use my background is very quickly analyze properties that are up on the market. It's pretty easy for me to go through active listings and see what might be exciting, what low-hanging fruit is there, what could potentially be mismarketed or just hasn't really been considered. I'm pretty familiar with the markets in Oregon and Washington from an appraisal standpoint, but then also appraisers are constantly having to know exactly what's on the market, where things are at, and quickly underwriting their comparables to be able to compare them to whatever property they are providing a valuation on. And so doing that on a regular basis, I'm pretty quick and have a lot of fun digging into what opportunities might be out there. I also would say that when I represent listings and sellers, I pride myself on providing a realistic offering memorandum that has actual expenses and factors in vacancy and credit loss and reserves, and presents the property in a realistic standpoint instead of just the highest cap rate that we could try to market. And then I also really like to work with my buyers and help understand what it is that they're looking for. Are you somebody that's later in life and you would like to retire and you want something really simple and cookie cutter and low risk? Great, let's look at that. Let's maybe look at a triple net sort of scenario with a long lease term. Or are you somebody that is really excited to be getting into commercial real estate and you want to mess around and play over the next 5 years and increase your income through adding new tenants and maybe a renovation or a spin off of carving out an additional excess piece of land? There's a lot of different varieties in the investment realm, and I love being able to work with buyers and help them navigate that and do some underwriting of numbers to see where that reflects on a cash flow basis and not just a basic NOI, cap it and kick it. We really want to look at where that income is. Some opportunities might not have fantastic return in the year one or year two, but with a little bit of tweaks and some additional effort, you can get them really cash flowing in year 3, 4, 5, and then have a nice investment into your 10-year hold. So helping buyers understand that and seeing where their flexibility and desires are is a lot of fun.
Awesome, very nice. Rae, you mentioned earlier that one of your typical buyers are maybe someone who is older and looking for something that's less management intensive, and triple net might be a potential target for them. Let's touch a little bit more on that. And maybe talk about absolute net versus triple net, what the differences are, and is there really such investment that is extremely passive and can accommodate those older individuals, maybe not necessarily older, someone who is just very busy or just not interested to be actively engaged in a business and wants something that's really, really passive?
Sure, I think there's an opportunity for every buyer in commercial real estate. And maybe that means you join a DST or another group, and that might be the best aspect. And I'm always happy to help line up my buyers and point them in that direction if it's not a direct purchase of a property. But there are also some fantastic triple net or absolute net properties. Like a single tenant freestanding tends to be more on the absolute net, where the tenant is also responsible for the building. They're responsible. Absolute means absolutely everything. They're responsible for anything that could possibly come up. And typically the tenant takes care of and pays for that directly. You're not paying the taxes and then being reimbursed by the tenant. The bill is going directly to them from the county. With that, anybody that's concerned about any sort of management, typically the tenant even pays a management fee to you, to which your line of management is likely taking a check to the bank if you haven't set up direct deposit, and knowing that you have the property and filing your taxes at the end of the year. Those typically are longer lease terms as well. You might be able to get a 20-year lease term that has set escalations, and you know exactly what that tenant is going to be paying for the next 20 years. And they usually have some sort of corporate guarantee or personal guarantee. The top ones that come to mind in retail could be something like a Hobby Lobby or a Burger King. There's also opportunities in the medical field, which it has pluses and minuses, but a lot of pluses, particularly lately. The medical field and vet clinics have done really well. Something like a dental clinic, where it might not be a corporate guarantee, but you would have a personal guarantee by the dentist who's operating that for the next 10 years. Not to mention that those are really great investments, I think, for somebody that wants some stability and security, because that tenant, that's also their livelihood, right? The dental world, they need to show up to their office every day and continue to perform. And so they are also incredibly invested in making sure that that location and opportunity continues. And they usually have set options as well. There's always the opportunity, if you're getting near the end of the lease term, to go back to that tenant and renegotiate as well. Would you do an option early and we'll knock rent off a little bit? And that's just an analysis of looking to at, is your rent at market? Is it below or above? And how can we help navigate a conversation with the tenant in order to get your investment lined up for the future that you're looking at and what you really want?
Very
Um,
nice.
sorry,
Oh, yeah, it was
that's a
good.
bit of a rambling answer. You had asked about the difference between absolute net and triple net. I want to make sure we circle back around to that. So I have found that does vary a little bit state to state. So I would definitely clarify and look into that and not just take somebody's word for what is triple net or absolute net. A lot of times in the state of Washington, we'll see a double net, and what I think they mean is more of a triple net compared to what we see in Oregon. But typically, we would say the triple nets are taxes, insurance, common area maintenance, right? All three nets. Double net would be two of the three, and a single net would be one of the three, and absolute's everything above. Where that really varies in state to state, broker to broker, is does that include management? Is there any sort of cap? Are the roof and the parking lot, is that going to be amortized and included and billed back to the tenant as well? Or is that the responsibility of the landlord? And really understanding those minute differences can have a significant impact, particularly on a single tenant investment where you're talking about the difference maybe between a 5 and a 5.2 cap rate.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. And it's good to know that there are differences on how double nets and triple nets presented and treated, and even the definition may differ from one state to another. So excellent point to keep in mind. In terms of buyers that are looking to buy something with potentially a value add. So we talked about one extreme where it's a very passive buyer, doesn't want to put too much effort into the project. Let's talk about the other extreme where you have someone who is full of energy and comes to you and says, I want something that's a value add, where there is an opportunity to buy it maybe at a slight discount, but I can bring value through different components. And let's talk about those components where they can bring value and what that deal may potentially look like.
Okay, yeah. So always a great one for that, I would say, is a retail strip center. Typically, you can buy a retail strip center occupied or close to occupancy, and yet there's still a lot of value add to be had. And that's always exciting. For one, banks love fully stabilized assets, and so typically you can get good financing, but you still have the ability to, over time, increase your value add without opening yourself up to a huge amount of risk in comparison to, say, a 50% occupied building that you instantly need to spend money on and get up to cash flow. And the bank's not going to love a 50% occupied building. So one thing that I think all buyers should really consider when they start looking at multi-tenant investments is the tenant mix. Who is in there? How does that work and flow together? What's going to be the synergy of that center? And historically, you can usually see if that's why it has succeeded or is in a point of failure. Some of my favorite tenant mix tenants are like the liquor store, UPS store, a hair salon and a nail salon, anything that people come to on a regular basis. I do hear pretty often, oh, I don't want a hair salon. That sounds like a nightmare. But that, for one, that tenant, that's their livelihood. They're going to make sure that they are there every day that they possibly can to continue to earn their income and then pay you to keep their spot open. But also that clientele is built up and they come on a regular basis. So if you're coming to get your hair cut every 8 weeks or your nails done every 4 weeks, you stop by and drop off your packages at UPS, and then maybe you go to a pub, which can be a great tenant depending on where they're at. A local pub has that daily traffic every single day. Same thing like a liquor store. they don't move often. They're pretty committed to where they're at, and they are pretty resilient in any sort of economy. So that's always the good tenant mix, figuring out what's there and who you could add. One thing that is really important to take into consideration when you're looking at that as well is parking requirements and where your center currently has its parking ratio. You'll find most often looking at zoning code that each type of tenant has a different parking requirement. So a UPS store might have a very low parking requirement because they have 2 people and they turn over every 15 minutes. A pub is going to have a very high parking requirement because they need 20 people to fill their space, and they're going to be there for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Um, so something to keep in mind, especially if you have a shell vacancy space, sometimes we'll see that where it's a strip center and it was built 15 years ago and there's a small space that's just never been occupied. Is that because our parking is maxed out and so there's a very limited amount of what can go in there? Or is the tenant mix not quite there? That's always something that you really need to dive in and understand, or just simply factor into your vacancy and credit loss when you're underwriting that property and say, hey, this space has always had a vacancy and it's probably always going to have a vacancy. So let's look at this center as only ever being 90% occupied. And if we're able to figure out and tweak a way to get that to 100% occupancy, great. But make sure you're doing that in your underwriting. The specialty restaurants are one that I provide caution against. Restaurants have benefits and minuses in general, but when they're super specialized, it tends to draw a big crowd at first when they open, and then has a hard time keeping a regular base instead of, say, like a Subway. Subway sandwiches do really well because somebody can eat that every single day for lunch. But if it is a unique food group or a crazy specialty, it's hard in order to get that daily customer and continued routine. Any questions on kind of the tenant mix and thoughts going into that?
I like where you're going, and I know you personally favor retail strip centers as one of the asset classes that probably has more opportunities in terms of value adds. So let's dive into what buyers should really pay attention to and how they can add value when they're dealing with the retail strip centers.
Sure. So looking at the lease expirations, making sure that your lease expirations are phased. Every now and again, you'll see somebody, they built a brand new center, let's say 5 years ago. They put in 10-year leases thinking this is great. I got everybody on a brand new 10-year lease. They're all 10% escalations. And then 10 years later, all of those tenant leases expire in the same month or within 3 months of each other. And the center has the opportunity to become completely vacant. So really making sure that when you're looking at that those are rolling, you've got maybe one every year, one every 18 months, and that you are continuing when you do that when you renew those leases to make sure that they are lining up in a phased position. Understanding where your rents are at above or below market as well, and what opportunities you have to increase those rents. And that's to say that a tenant might be in there with only a year left on their lease, and you're thinking, great, they're below market. I'm going to bring them up to market next year, and this property is going to cash flow. But if their option says that it's set with a 2% escalation for the next 20 years, or they've got 20 years of options that keep them below market, the economies of that would say that that tenant is going to stay. They have that leasehold value and they have no incentive to ever move out. And you are going to be losing that section of your market income for the near to very long future. Same, different, but risk when a tenant is above market. I really struggle when somebody is excited about that because that is only for a period of time and it's a high risk tenant. So if a tenant's paying above market and they're in there for 3 years, you might get a little additional income, but when that comes time to renew, they are likely going to try to negotiate their option, even if their option is set to be something closer to market, or they're going to leave and you're going to be stuck leasing those spaces up, which can take time and money, right? You're paying your leasing commission, your tenant improvement allowance, free rent, plus the time where it's vacant, and any triple nets during that time as well. What kind of my big caution to investors always too is when you're underwriting your retail strip center and looking at that, you should be putting in a vacancy and credit loss. Let's say it's anywhere from 3 to 10%, depending on the historical occupancy of the center. And any lender is also going to be putting in a vacancy and credit loss. So you're underwriting, you're buying that property with a vacancy and credit loss in place. I advise that you take that vacancy and credit loss every year, put it aside, and then when you do have a vacancy, you have the funding, hopefully, to be able to get the tenant that you want, take your time, and maybe provide a little bit of additional TI or free rent to help make sure that it's a great fit for the space. It's really easy. It's already been considered. So just take that extra little income and set it on the side. Escalations as well, looking at when those escalations are occurring for tenants and how they're structured. Often we'll see a percentage escalation in retail where it maybe is 3% every year, or it could be based on the CPI. Understanding what that is. Understanding too that when it is a CPI based escalation, sometimes there's additional cost in order to do that from your management company. It's not as simple as just adding 3%. And so that could be something to consider, especially if you were talking about a center with 30 different tenants and various different escalations, or maybe it's 3% plus CPI or 1.5%, or a minimum of this and a maximum of that. The more complicated that escalation is, the more complicated it's going to be, more expensive it is to figure out every single year on a management basis. And then sometimes you'll see where an escalation is set more like 10% every 5 years. Consider what that is, who that tenant is, and how big of an impact that's going to be for them. If it is a local tenant who has been great and they've been moving right along, a 10% bump could be very significant to their operations, and they simply might not be able to do that. Or you're going to put a really big strain on them, and chances are they don't even know they signed their lease. Maybe it was 5-10 years ago. They haven't considered that all of a sudden their rent's going up 10%, and they're going to be a little flabbergasted. So understanding where that's at. If it's a corporate tenants are completely used to that style of escalation, but working with them and seeing where things are and within reason.
Excellent answer, Rae. So you talked about corporate guarantee and personal guarantee from maybe medical practices, and then corporate guarantee from larger big box retailers. If the owner has two options on the table, get a tenant with a corporate guarantee versus get just a regular mom and pop, is it always by default you should choose the one with a corporate guarantee, or there are pros and cons to both?
I think there's pros and cons to both. Really understanding what you need in your center is a good place to start as well. And how committed that tenant is and sort of what their vision, where they're at. A local mom and pop can be a fantastic tenant. They are committed to that space and ensuring that you're giving rent, and they can be there a really long time. Also, if a mom and pop is putting in additional tenant improvements, and that might be a way to sort of ask them to double down on their space, right? Say, I'm willing to give you 50% of your tenant improvements, but I need you to come with 50%. Now they're not only invested in the fact that they're paying rent to you every month, but they've just dumped $200,000 into their space with an additional loan to start up their business. They're not jumping ship, right? They're not just moving across the street because there's a new center that just redid their parking lot. They're pretty committed to making sure that they can stay in that space and work with you for a long period of time. Corporate tenants can be great on an underwriting basis. Obviously, financial institutions love corporate tenants. There's some sort of back security there. But corporate tenants can also go dark. And that's a clause that you can also read and make sure you understand in your leases, and you will definitely find it in a corporate lease. But if they decide that they're going to go dark and close that space, they still have to pay you rent, but nobody's there. Nobody's activating that space. So you're not getting those customers to come in and go to the Burger King pad and then also next door to your local UPS store or the nail store. So you're really losing that. You can also find in larger centers, there will be typically another go dark clause. So let's say you have a grocery anchored shopping center and your grocery anchor goes dark. They are still going to continue to pay rent. They have to, unless they've filed bankruptcy and closed. But within most of the other leases, particularly the other corporate leases in that center, so let's say you have an Albertsons and then you've got a Subway and maybe another corporate tenant, some Jamba Juice, they're going to say that if a percentage of your center goes dark, they can also abandon their lease. So you might not just lose the draw of your big tenant, and or maybe your tenant has filed bankruptcy and they leave, but you can also lose several of your small inline tenants because you now have a center that's not doing well, that's not bringing traffic, and they don't feel like they can be supported. So there's definitely cautions and pluses and minuses to both.
Makes sense. Well, you're obviously in Washington and Oregon markets. So let's talk about that landscape. How would you say during your time that you became a broker, those two markets have evolved over the last couple of years?
Oh, I mean, if you've seen any news in the last couple of years, you know that Portland, Oregon is not viewed tremendously well on a national front. Unfortunately, we are investing in the city. Things are getting cleaned up. It is really hard, however, to get investors to put their money in Portland. Because of that, I do think there's some great opportunity. There's an extra 100 to 200 basis points on cap rates for some of those investments. There is higher occupancy. Most of them, if you're talking like on an office front, a lot of those are not going to cash flow for the next 4 or 5 years, but you can pick up a really great opportunity that will cash flow in 4 or 5 years. It's just a bit of a gamble on whether you see the city coming back or not. I know that I'm a big part of NAIOP as well, and NAIOP is very committed to working on development and legislation, and so we're very involved with what's going on politically here and making sure that our voice is heard and that development and investment continues to be at the forefront of those decisions and elections. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. There is also a lot of opportunity in our more rural areas or kind of secondary, tertiary markets. We experienced a lot of moving out of the city to these outdoor Oregon and Washington are full of beautiful places where those that can work remote, it's increased that overall desire to be in these other markets. And so there's some great opportunity there. Washington does very well. I would say Washington does a little bit better on the corporate leases, the fast foods, and some of the bigger box, because they have a very large military base in Washington. And so you have people that come in and they've lived all across the country maybe, and they just got relocated to somewhere in Washington, and what they really want is a piece of home, and they can go find that in a Chick-fil-A sandwich. Wow. And so Washington does really well with that, with those different investments.
Excellent. That's great. As one of the final questions, and of course we share the information in the chat for anyone who wants to reach out. Rae's phone number, email, and the website for the company she works for, SVN, is in the chat, so feel free to grab that. As one of our final fun questions, we usually like to ask our interviewees, what do you like to do for fun?
As a true Oregonian and somebody who loves the Pacific Northwest, I like to golf, hike, and snowboard.
Oh,
Those are
wow.
my three activities. I have a 9-month-old daughter. She got
Wow.
a snowboard and a golf club for Christmas. So we are not trying to influence her or anything, but definitely would love for her to also take up those activities.
Amazing. Yeah, well, I'm sure if not yet, then eventually she will definitely partake in all of those activities with you.
Yeah.
That's that's awesome. Excellent. Well, Rae, thank you so much for the interview. A lot of value added, a lot of great information and food for thought for our investors and the like. We really appreciate you and hope to have you back at some point in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time. And yes, I would love to talk to any of you out there, even if you're not interested in the Oregon or the Washington market. If I can help pair you up with somebody else from our SpiriVennet network. It is a global company. Or if you just have a question or want to talk through something, I'm here. Be lovely to meet you. Thank you
Awesome.
so much. Appreciate it.
Bye.